Hi everyone, I'm Nikki and welcome back to the Fundamentals of Print Design. This lesson we're going to go right into common design mistakes that you need to avoid when working on any of your print projects. This is going to be a brief overview of those common design mistakes, and the biggest thing to remember when it comes to this is overuse. Overuse of all of these elements I'm going to talk about is really the number one thing that you need to be aware of. So let's go ahead and get started. The first item is gradients. Again, overuse of gradients. I see this all the time. We're using a lot of different colors in gradients. We're using a lot of gradients throughout the entire document. So here's something to keep in mind. When you want to use a gradient, the best thing you can do is minimize the colors in that gradient. Stick with maybe a monochromatic palette. For example, if you're going to be using blue, use a light blue and then a darker blue to contrast that and create your gradient. But don't throw in a bunch of colors in between. Stick to just a general color palette with your gradient and it'll look a lot cleaner and it'll be a lot easier to place elements like photos and text on top of that gradient. It makes it easier for your audience to read it. The next thing to keep in mind is your font use. You really need to limit how many fonts you use in your document to 3 or less. So for example, you can use a serif font for your headline and make it larger, and a sans serif font for your body text and make that smaller, and vice versa. And then you can pick a third font to throw in there for a contrast. For example, in my headline, sometimes I like to have a sans serif font for my headline, make it really large and really blocky, but then just to throw a contrast, I might pick a word that I want to emphasize and use a script or a more handwritten font. Another thing to keep in mind with fonts is you want them to really match together and look like they belong. You don't want like an old-timey font mixed with a real modern font. There may be a use for that, but as a general rule, you do want all of your fonts to look like they go together. You don't want it to look too far or dated. And again, keep it to 3 or less. If you can actually keep it to 2, that's a really good place to be. But a third one is optional, and don't overdo it. Really think about how you want to use those fonts, and do not have an equal saturation of all 3 fonts. Rather, you have your dominant font, and then it goes down from there. The next thing is low resolution images. This is really big. We see this all the time. Really, you need to keep with those high resolution images that we've talked about in a previous lesson to make your design stand out. The higher the resolution, the better you'll be. Then there's the tricky part of too much information on your document. There's a lot of cases where you can get really busy because there's a lot of content to put on something. Flyers, for example, can get very busy. There's a lot of details to fit on there. But what you need to do is look at your content, lay it all out. This is all that you have to work with. All of my photos, all of my text, and then it works like a puzzle. Pick out those really important parts, emphasize those with larger fonts and color, and then you have your supporting text and other content. Then you also want to keep in mind that white space. You don't want elements too close to the edge, and you don't want elements too close together. The more space you have between your elements, the easier it is to read, and it looks nicer overall. It's easier on the eye. So really pay attention to what's going on with all of your content, how much space is between it, how they work together, how they contrast, colors, and all of that. Now when it comes to space, one thing that I always do is I bring my elements in 1/4 of an inch on all sides. I'll place guides around my document, regardless of whether it's a flyer, poster, whatever. I really try to stay 1/4 of an inch inside, and that'll give me a lot of space on the outside. Even if I'm going to have a bleed, I want to make sure there's plenty of cushion and space around there, and it makes your design look better, and it saves important content from being trimmed off if you do have a bleed in your document. So that's just a quick look at some common design mistakes that you can avoid. And now that you're all equipped with what to avoid when it comes to designs, you know the principles of design and the elements of design, it's time to go into InDesign and learn some of the basics to setting up our document for our first project. Thanks for watching.